In this video, you're going to learn about the checkbox, and this is going to allow us to add in things that need to either be true or false. So for example, do we want to show the completed to-dos or not? We could set up a checkbox for that, and you'll actually be doing just that for the challenge in this video. Before we get into all of that, let's go ahead and just explore how the checkbox works. Over in the Notes app HTML file, I'm going to remove this form we created in the last video. This was done for example purposes only, and it's not going to make its way into the final version of the application. We'll talk more about how we're going to create notes a bit later. We're actually going to have a separate page for that. I'm going to save the file, and we're also going to delete the event handler for that form over here. If we don't have the form, we definitely don't need an event handler for it. Now let's mess around with the checkbox. Over inside of our HTML file, we're going to add this checkbox in, and I'll put it down here. The Notes app isn't actually going to have a checkbox on this page. The To-Do app, though, will. Let's go ahead and mess around with it. To create a checkbox, we still use the input element. So right here, input, and it is still an empty element. The only thing we're going to change is the type. So we don't want a type of text, which is the default value. For a checkbox, we use a type of, appropriately, checkbox. This is going to render a little checkbox to the screen, and if I go ahead and save the markup, what do we get? We get a little checkbox showing up right here. I can check it, I can uncheck it, it works exactly as you might expect. Now for inputs, we have the placeholder. For buttons, we have our button text, but for checkboxes, there's no description of what this is, so we're definitely going to want to add a label, letting the user know what this checkbox is supposed to represent. Now, when we're trying to add little labels to our inputs or our checkboxes, there's a special tag for that. This is the label tag. Let's set up label right here. It has an opening and closing tag, and we put our input inside of it. So in this case, I could take my checkbox input and put it right inside of the label. And now what we do is we put our labeled text either before or after. For a checkbox, it typically comes after, and I could say something like check me for fun. This is going to have the result of showing some text next to the checkbox, but the nice thing about using label is that if we actually click that text, it's also going to check the box. So the user doesn't have to go all the way over to the little box to actually check it. They can just click anywhere in this region to get that done. That's a fantastic feature, and it's just from label. If I were to swap out label with something else, like a paragraph, we would no longer get that behavior. In this case, clicking the text does nothing. It allows us to highlight it, sure, but it's not going to interact with the checkbox. We have to use label for that. We can use label with our checkboxes, but we can also use it with other forms of input. I could provide a label for this guy up above, for example. I could wrap it in a label, setting up a label opening and closing tag. I'll cut out the closing tag and paste it down below. Now right here, we could put our text just before the input. So right here, I could say something like search, :space. And if I were to save the file, what happens? We get a little search label up front. And if I click it, it actually just focuses us right on the input. So that's a feature because we're using label. Clicking the label brings us to the input. Now the input itself actually has a small typo that should be filter notes and not filter to-dos. Now in this case, we can choose whether or not we really want to have a label. For this input, I'm going to say we don't need a label, so I am going to go ahead and remove that. I just added the label tag to show you that it works with not just checkboxes, but with all of the inputs that we can use inside of our applications. Now that we have the basic checkbox set up, let's go ahead and figure out how we can get its value, either whether it's checked or unchecked, from JavaScript. If we're going to target this from JavaScript, we should probably give it a unique ID. ID equals, I'll just call this one for fun, since this one isn't going to make it into the final version of the Notes app. The Notes app doesn't actually need a checkbox on this page, though the To-Do app does. Now we can save this and target our for fun ID. We're going to be setting up an event listener. So document.querySelector. We're looking for an element where the ID equals for fun. And the event that we're going to be using is the change event. So I'll use add event listener. The first argument is the event to listen for, change, and the second is the function to run. And with this function, like with all of our event handlers, we get the event argument, which I will name E. Now, when we first explored our text-based inputs, we saw that we had access to both change and input, and there was a clear advantage. Input allowed us to get the new value on every keystroke, as opposed to having to wait until the user typed something and then clicked away. Not what we wanted. With checkboxes, though, we are just going to use the change event, and it's going to fire as soon as the checkbox gets checked or unchecked. Over here, let's go ahead and get its value. We still need to use e.target. This is where the actual input lives, but we're not going to be using the value prop like we would for a text-based field. For checkboxes, we actually have a checked property, and this is a Boolean. So it's true if the checkbox is now checked. It's false if the checkbox is now unchecked. Let's go ahead and just print this to the screen using console.log. Up front, console.log, wrapping it in parentheses, and then we're going to save the file and start checking that box. Over here, we have nothing in the console yet, and if we check the box, we can see we get a message. We get true, because our checkbox is now checked. If I were to uncheck it, we get false, and we're going to see this value regardless of whether we check the box or the text. The exact same effect happens. We switch between true or false. And this is going to allow us to do some pretty cool things, and we're going to be using the checkbox in the to-do application to hide or show the completed to-dos. Let's switch over to the to-do app JS file to discuss the details of this one. Down at the bottom, I have a 4-step solution to get this challenge completed. Now, as we move through the course, yes, these challenges are going to get a bit more complex. They're not going to get more complex with respect to what you already know. They're only ever going to be things you've already learned about. They're going to get more complex because you're going to have to do a bit more and put more pieces together. So it won't be just adding something to an array or just setting up an event listener. It'll be setting up an event listener that adds something to an array, for example. In this case, we're going to have to combine what we know about filtering and what we just learned about checkboxes. So step 1 is to create a new checkbox with a text value of something like hide completed. It will be unchecked by default, and you're going to set up an event listener for that checkbox. So we have this checkbox in place, and we have some code we can run when its value changes. Step 2 is to create a new filter alongside of our search text filter. The search text filter has a default value of an empty string. The default value for this one, hide completed, is going to be the Boolean false. So by default, the checkbox is unchecked and our filter is false. Now, under those situations, I would expect all of the to-dos to show up. The next thing you're going to do is actually update the event handler function. When someone checks or unchecks that box, we want to update hide completed correctly by using what we just learned, and we want to re-render that list. So we're going to re-render the list, much like we re-render the list when someone changes the search text input. Now, all of this is great, but it's not actually going to change what shows up unless we make a modification to render to-dos. So that's the last thing you're going to need to do. In render to-dos, you're going to need to take this filter into account. If it's true, then we don't want to show ones that are completed. If it's false, then we want to show everything because they have not checked that hide completed checkbox. So that's going to require you to add another filter call up here, manipulating our filter to-dos array. Now, I know this is quite a bit of information to take in, and I don't expect this challenge to be as short as some of the other ones, but getting you to solve these more complex problems is going to be essential for you to be able to solve real-world problems when the course is over. As always, if you get a bit stuck or you can't get one part of it, that's okay. We're going to move through the entire process together so you can learn from your mistakes, or maybe tweak your code to figure out a different way to get the same task done. All right, pause the video, test your work, try to wire up this button. When you're done, go ahead and click play. How'd that one go? I'm sure I'm going to get some new questions in the Q&A complaining about this one, but let's go ahead and knock it out. The first step is to create that checkbox. So I'll start over here. I didn't tell you where to put it. I'm just going to put it next to my other filter. That seems to make sense. I'll set up my label. In here, I'll set up my checkbox, input, type equals checkbox, And I'll also set up an ID so I can target this one. Show completed seems appropriate. And then what I'm going to do is set up my label. Now the label I picked for this one is hide completed. And I'll actually switch that from show completed to hide completed to match. Perfect. So that is all we need to do in the HTML file. And if we do view the application, I should see that clicking the button does indeed check the box. Everything seems to be working well. We can now switch over to JavaScript because all of the other steps happen over here. We want to set up an event listener. Let's do just that. We're going to select it. Document.query selector, selecting by ID. We're looking for hide completed. And we're going to use the add event listener method. We are listening for a change event. And what are we going to do when things change? Well, for the moment, we're going to do nothing. So we have step 1 completed. We got our checkbox and we've set up the event listener. Step 2 is to create a new filter, hide completed, with a default value of false. That's an easy one. Up above, we already have one filter. We're going to add a second one right here. Hide completed equals false. Now that we have the default filter set up, that's it for step 2, and we can move on to step 3, which is to do something meaningful inside of this function. We want to do basically what we did here. We're going to update a filter, and we're going to tell the list to re-render itself. So right here, I'm going to set filters dot hide completed equal to, and we want to set it equal to the checkbox value, e.target. And remember, for checkboxes, we use the checked property. So this is going to set hide completed equal to true when the checkbox is checked, and it's going to set hide completed equal to false when the checkbox is not checked, which is exactly what we want. Now we can go ahead and call the function render to-dos. I'm going to call it passing in the to-dos and the filters, which have now been updated. Now from here, we've completed step 3, and the last thing we have to do is the most important. We have to actually take this filter into account inside of the render to-dos function. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll up here. The goal is to modify filtered to-dos before we continue on down the function. Now this step 4, was the trickiest of all of them, and it was also the one most open to interpretation. There are a lot of valid ways we could have gotten this done, so I'm actually going to work through a few different solutions. The first one is going to be us, down below, setting a new value for filtered to-dos. We're going to set it equal to, and here we're going to call filtered to-dos.filter. So we're going to take the already filtered array and whittle it down further. Now, if we're going to assign a new value to filter to-dos, we'll switch this const over to let. Now we can set up our filter call, passing in our function, getting access to our to-do, and doing something meaningful. What we really want to do is figure out if that checkbox is checked or not. So if filters dot hide completed. So if it is checked, we're going to have this code run right here. If it is not checked, we'll set up an else clause, and we're going to have this code run right here. If it's not checked, we're going to be showing all to-dos, so I'll just return true, making sure that every single one stays in for this filter. If, on the other hand, it is checked, we need to take the to-dos completed value into account. We only want to keep the ones that have not been completed. So right here, I'm going to return. We're going to access the already Boolean value to-do.completed. The only problem is that this is the opposite of what we want. This is going to return true for things that have been completed, keeping just those. We want to only return true for things that have not been completed. So we'll flip the Boolean like this using the logical not operator. Now, this is a perfectly valid way to solve the problem, and if I save the file, it should work as expected. Right here, we see all of the to-dos showing up. If I check things, we see that we just have our two to-dos printed. Now, this is currently still showing the correct information, and if I were to filter it down further, we can see that things still work. So now we have multiple ways to filter our data, which is fantastic. Now, this is just one way to solve the problem. I'll show you another one. In the other solution, we're actually going to comment out the if statement, and we're going to replace it with one of those one-liners, which I'll put right here. Right off the bat, we're just going to return filters dot, and we're going to access hide completed. Now this is going to show everything when the checkbox is checked and show nothing when it's not. So right here we see nothing. I check it, we see everything. That's not exactly what we want, so we're going to start by flipping it on its head using the logical not operator. Now we're going to see everything when the checkbox isn't checked, and when the checkbox is checked, we see nothing. Now obviously, when the checkbox is checked, there are still things we want to keep. So to do that, to set up that logic, we're going to use the logical OR operator. So we want to filter based off of hide completed or, and in the OR case, what we're going to do is use the logical not operator with to-do dot completed. So this code is always going to return false for to-dos that have been completed, and it's always going to return true for to-dos that have not been completed. So this is going to have the effect of always keeping our incomplete to-dos regardless of what this evaluates to, because we're using the logical OR operator. So as long as one of these is true, the whole thing is true. Now we have the behavior we had before with a one-liner. If I save things, we can see that live server is keeping that checkbox checked, which is a bit annoying. But if I uncheck it to get us back to our natural state, we can see that as we check and uncheck, things filter correctly. I check the box, we just see our incomplete ones. I uncheck it and everything comes back. Now there's one more solution I want to show you real quick. We can avoid two filter calls altogether by putting all of this up above right here. Let's go ahead and see how that might work. To get that done, I'm going to create a couple of consts. A const right here called search text match, and we'll give that a value in a second. And down below, another const called hide completed match. And then we're going to take the expressions we use to calculate each and just paste them right there. So search text match equals whatever we had down before in return. Then we're going to take this one, copy it, and paste it right here for hide completed match. Now we can actually remove that filter call we set up altogether, which means that we can switch this from let back to const. All we need to do is switch up what we return. I am going to return search text match and hide completed match. So if the given to do matches our search text and it also matches the hide completed checkbox, we'll show it. Otherwise, we won't. And this has the exact same effect as what we had before, but in my opinion, it is a better way to set things up. So now if we check the box, we get the same behavior and we can still filter. So I can still type in cat, for example, and the filter is going to work as expected. So there we have it. All of those solutions would have been perfectly valid. You do not need to switch yours to mine just because I'm showing you this. If you have a solution and it's working, that's great. If you're not sure if it's a good solution or if it's going to work correctly, you can always open up a question in the Q&A. So big props for getting this far. You now are able to solve problems on your own with JavaScript, which is fantastic considering we didn't know the language about 50 videos ago. We're going to continue talking about forms in the next video, though this section is coming to a close, so I will see you then.